What we've seen with the modifier stack is a way of working procedurally or parametrically. We're modeling an object based upon parameters. We're not actually selecting individual parts of the model and manipulating them on a sort of base level. We're dealing with these very high-level properties or parameters, or sometimes called attributes. And the way that 3ds Max stores this is by very simple instructions. It's like a recipe for baking a cake. When you save the scene file, what 3ds Max stores for this particular object is not the explicit position of each point and line on the object. All that's stored are some very simple instructions, like make a box, give it these number of segments, set it to this height, width, and depth, then add a taper that has this angle, and add a bend that has this amount of curvature, and so on. So these very simple instructions are the parameters that end up generating the model. And in fact, every time you open the scene, 3ds Max runs through that algorithm or that recipe once again and recreates the object out of nothing. It's not actually storing the object as an object. It's merely storing the instructions on how to make that object. For a very simple and trivial scene like this, that's not really going to be an issue. But if you have a complex scene that has many objects or many modifiers and there's a lot of stuff going on, then that procedural process and that process of following the recipe to make the object can really bog down the machine. And it could actually cause some unpleasant issues in which your object doesn't come out as planned. So, for these reasons, once you've completed an object using a procedural method or using any modifiers really, you should collapse the modifier stack. This is a way of converting the procedural or rules-based object into an explicit object. And in our cake analogy, you're baking the cake. Once you collapse the modifier stack, from that point forward, the object is no longer stored merely as instructions or a recipe. In fact, the object's explicit shape and size and so on is stored, and the exact position of every point in that object is stored. So this is known as collapsing the modifier stack. In other programs, there are other terms for this. In Maya, for example, it's called deleting the construction history. But it's basically the same concept. You're converting from a procedural or parametric object into a raw polygon mesh that's merely a collection of points and lines. All right, now there are multiple ways of collapsing the stack in 3ds Max. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter which method you use, as long as you do it in the proper way, which is that you should save the scene file to a specific version, then collapse the stack, and then save to a new version. That way, you always have the procedural version of your model, and if you need to, you can go back to that and make changes. If you overwrite that procedural version, then you will never be able to get back to those parameters. And just like with baking a cake, you can't unbake a cake, right? Once it's been baked, that's it, unless you have a time machine. And in 3ds Max and other 3D programs, the time machine is your version history. It's the different scene files that you've saved out at very specific and important points along the production pipeline. So again, this is important that you save the scene, then collapse the stack, and then save again to a different file name or a different version number. One way of converting to a non-procedural or raw mesh object is to go up into the Modify stack and right-click on the top modifier and choose Collapse All. And that way it will convert it to something called an editable mesh. I'll go ahead and execute that. And we get a warning saying, do you really want to do this? Because you're going to wipe out all these parameters. And yes, I do want to do that. And now it's been converted to a raw mesh object called an editable mesh. Now, editable mesh is a very simple and a very old form of polygon object in 3ds Max. It's not really that much used for modeling anymore, but it's a very lightweight form of mesh object. In other words, it doesn't have very much of a memory footprint and it processes very quickly. So if you've got a very heavy object or heavy scene that has a lot going on in it, then editable mesh might be a good choice because it's very lightweight and efficient. If you want to do further work on your model, then instead of editable mesh, you want to convert to editable poly. And we will learn a lot more about that in the next chapter when we look at the graphite ribbon. But you can convert to editable poly instead of editable mesh if you want to keep working on your model. So I'm going to undo that collapse command just with Control Z. We're back to our modifier stack. To convert to editable poly, what you do is right-click on the object, and you get this pop-up menu. It's a context-sensitive menu called the quad menu. And at the bottom right of the quad menu, you will see Convert to, and there's some options there. Choose Convert to Editable Poly. Now that's been converted. And you can see once again that all of the modifiers are gone, and you have a different object type now. And once again, that's the final step of creating a polygon model or a mesh model. At the end of your workflow, you will convert to editable mesh or editable poly, and then save your scene file out to a new version. And in fact, I will do that now just to underscore the importance of that. I will save out as collapsing modifier stack finished. So if I ever need to go back to the previous version, which has the procedural modifier still intact, then I can open the other version of the scene and make those changes. That's a basic introduction to the modifier stack, and it completes our chapter in modeling basics.